now we get to SIL. They were the intro parts. Right. And this is the longer section, but I do think a lot of the concepts you will have already heard. But again, I just want to give those building blocks. We may not get to the last slides, but if we need to chat later about that, I can do maybe an hour session as included in the costing online for people once I get home to really talk about that. So this is where I'm going to break down your emotional attachment to SIL. So SIL providers, all they do, please remember I was one, is put paid support workers in an environment to do support work in the home. That is it. That is what SIL providers do. They train those people, they make sure that they're supervised and performance managed, so every layer of management you have is included in that hourly cap. That is it. They are not bus drivers, they are not community participation providers, they are not support coordinators, they are not informal families. They are literally just support workers in the home doing daily activities. Really sorry.
EAP is available.
I'm now going to tell you, you are not SIL providers. Part of what you do is supported independent living, and you do a hell of a lot more, and I hope you do, because you're a really good service. So when we think SIL, we think everything we are doing for a person needs to be wrapped up in that roster of care. Please stop doing that. Please stop trying to shove it into that Excel spreadsheet, because that's not where it should be. This is all that should be in that Excel spreadsheet so that we can actually afford to do those things. Who's going to pay for the training? They have, but we're using it to run buses. If we take the buses out, we'll have more left for training. I know that's a really unfair, and I know I'd say it with humour. That is part of a big restructure. It's a big thing to go, all right, what did we do because we didn't know what the hell to do with it? What did we leave in there? And how do we now start moving that stuff out where it's appropriately funded so that that gap between what we pay the staff and what is left over can actually cover just these functions. And in relation to training, some of the training that you are doing should be funded by the participant, not from this overhead, and we'll get back to that later as well. So the bottom bit acknowledges historically that is not what SIL providers did. We did everything. So it makes sense that we took the block funded mentality and we went into SIL and we said, okay, this is what we do now. But now we need to really start to challenge that. And until we remove our connection and identity as being locked to those three words, it actually doesn't mean anything. The only people that need to know that it's SIL is the people in claiming. You need to know that you support people in their homes. How that money comes into the bank account, not your problem. You do need to figure out how to get it funded, but
it's a little bit your problem.
little bit.
Yeah,
So-
definitely our problem.
Historically, we had a home, and you generally, unless you owned it, and there was other models, but the predominant amount of in Victoria was you tended for a home and the supports within the home. And the guidelines on how you provided that support was from the governing body, and you had to fit within their risk appetite. So a lot of our risk averse approaches are because of the risk averse approach of DHHS. I don't want to end up in the media. You can't do that, Rebecca. Prove to me it's going to be right. So that we have been trained to work in a particular way by the state government's risk approach. And we need to break that down. So it was welfare based, and that means that really, if people stayed static, it was okay, because that's what welfare was. It was about making sure these people have safe, supported homes to be able to build skills if they can, but otherwise just stay there. The NDIS doesn't mean that we need to create miracles and throw them all out into fend for themselves. It's not a free-for-all. But it did change to an insurance-based model, which means that we want to invest more. We know that people with disability have capacity. We know that they can get outcomes, and we only know that because providers like Life Without Barriers have been getting outcomes for a really long time. So let's fund that. Let's legitimately make it more possible and facilitate it rather than staying in this mentality. So the home and the support provided within them were linked, and a lot of the time the support cross-subsidised the home because homes are expensive. And but also, if your grocery bill went higher than the allocation, and generally that was the board payment, then that was taken from your support budget. So it directly linked to it. And we thought, well, Life Without Barriers pays for that. No, the board and the funding should have been able to cover everything off. So when our profit and loss went over, our supports would have to go down. Now, the good thing is that when person 3 moved out, the funding didn't reduce. So if we had vacancies, they were actually beneficial, because for a really long time we got to bankroll ourselves a little bit and put some away for a rainy day, which was great. So we didn't really have the pressure to fill those vacancies. The government did, because they knew that we were in a bit of a windfall, so they would be pushing for those to be filled. But it really meant that that place could function as a whole. And our use of paid staff was the primary response to support need or RIC, and generally that's because accessing technology equipment assessments was really difficult, and some people, especially the initiative of getting people out of nursing homes, I was part of opening some of those homes, and those people with ABI came across with a whole heap of allied health funding, and it was like, wow, mind blown that this is possible. And all of the supports that came in there, it was great. But for people with intellectual disability or complex needs that were living in group homes, they were more likely to just have paid support staff as a response. You could have got SWEP, you could have got those type of things, but it was rare. There was long waiting lists, and to get access to allied health, normally the organisation would invest, or you would have to go on a waiting list for the mainstream allied health. And for those places, you go in for the exact problem you have, and then you get discharged and you have to go back again. So it was this never-ending cycle of, can't you just stay? No, see you later. So a lot of...
Can I test one of my assumptions? So we transitioned from block funding to NDIA 2019, so not long ago. The political climate, there was a lot of pressure. NDIA had overspent. The houses we have are mainly 5, 6, up to 7. The way it looks like it was done using economies of scale, larger houses, less funding, higher ratios.
Yep.
Therefore, if you try and take a 6-bedroom house, make it smaller, you can't do it.
Yep.
And the houses with 6 and 7, when someone leaves, there was agreement to not make the target 5, but the funding stays the same.
Yes.
Which doesn't work.
Yes.
So it looks like it's just bad timing when it happens, and the way they approached it. Would that be...
The Ordinary Life at Home consultation paper said we will no longer financially support locations over 5 people.
Yes, but they won't adjust the funding.
No, they will not.
Even though at the beginning they said
because theoretically, you told them for that time period that they could share supports between 6 people.
No, they made the decision.
I know, but theoretically, they have been.
Yes.
So they can. It's possible. Not ideal, but it's possible. So yes, bad timing. Really unfortunate that we had these larger homes that have set a precedent. And also, they are starting to try and push for smaller environments, but the evidence we have suggests that it's possible. We need to change the evidence and really start to now look at why isn't it possible for that to happen, and increase the funding where we can, and sometimes that'll be capacity building. Yeah, it's the transition is clunky and it's unhelpful. People who are really being disadvantaged are people with disability, as we have all these, government shifting to try and make it all work. But
okay. Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome. This is what individualised funding looked like for the last 6 years.
Yeah.
And part of that is, again, letting go of that forever home mentality.
Yeah.
So if we keep trying to make it work in this place for this person, they're not going to have the opportunity to see new things. And it's hard because we promise them forever homes. And some people want that. And, but I also think sometimes our emotional attachment to forever homes might be firmer than the person's.
Becca, with the lifestyle approach,
Yeah.
can that be linked with that in terms of
Yeah.
in terms of, because there's significant gaps with age as well in our homes as well.
Yes. So don't say I'm aging, so therefore say at this stage of my
Different
life,
stages, yes.
these are the supports that are important to me. Here are my goals that match it. Here's how it's related to my disability, and here's how I want my new plan to be built. Not because I'm aging, because I'm at a different stage of my life.
The other component that's unique to divested houses than other houses that I've worked with is state government had to put people into homes out of necessities.
Yes.
Compatibility isn't necessarily right.
Correct.
That doesn't happen in the non-state government run locations,
Yes.
and that's the whole
Yes, it is.
issue to unpack in itself.
Yeah. And look, this is every single part of this are really big issues. Like there's nothing we haven't talked about that hasn't taken us off on a tangent. And I think what's really important is not to go, oh my goodness, this is too overwhelming. I don't know how to do this. Pick something. The people in this room can instantly change their language and instantly change their submissions, while other people are working on trying to get the funding right. So it's about what is within my control and how can I start to shift this to where it needs to be. And a lot of the things that I'm giving you today are instantly able to be implemented in your space, not, well, what are we going to do about that? So I think that's really important as well. So when we first transitioned to the NDIS, this is what individualised funding looked like. It's not what it looks like today, where we took that pie and we broke it down to try and assess the individual. However, we were still funding the location. So when you put in your roster of care, and I've got something a few slides up, you were able to take that strip down the bottom and make it all white. And then everyone went, well done us. And then the agency was like, well done you. And then, so individuals still had to form together a cohesive unit. And if person one's circumstances changed, we were able to get change of circumstances for everyone else in the home to get it back to the cohesive unit. So we were still working under funding locations and a block funded mentality because we were making sure that everything fit together. Now, the home and the supports are separate. We're no longer funding locations. You used to be able to, if you had a vacancy, sometimes get the support needs increased for everyone else in the home. They're not doing that anymore. They're saying if you want to know where they said it, it was in the SIL operational guidelines, where they said to people, SIL providers cannot increase your supports just because someone moved out. That's it. They need to figure out that's their loss, which is really unfair. Because why should we cover the cost of that when we didn't set up the homes and they're not how we'd want them and they're not how people would want them? And we didn't make 7-room homes and now try to go to 3. But this is the transition we're in. NDIA is no longer interested in the viability of the location. You cannot vary your ratios to create whole numbers. Some legacy supports are being, I'm really sorry, that sounds harsh, are being removed. So we had 3 people in a home, 1 person legitimately needed active night support. So the department converted that location into an active night home because people weren't individualised. So we then funded that location as active night. When we transitioned in, people then got what they had before. And now they're looking at them and saying, you need it and you two don't. So again, we've got a mismatched funding amount and the whole location is't viable.
Yeah.
But the
And we got
NDIA
by that during the transfer itself,
Yes.
and now more.
Yes, yeah. Plan reviews are only used for a change in the participant's diagnosis, functional capacity. Something legitimately in me has changed, not my provider isn't viable anymore. Up until now, you have been able to say, this doesn't work for us. They don't care about it anymore. Support's not the NDIA responsibility are being removed, so the justice stuff, they're saying your language says it's a justice problem, I don't want to hear about it. And the language and evidence we've talked about today to justify funding has changed, because a lot of our language are about viability and about ratios and all of those type of things, and definitely the approach to claiming is very similar. So all of those change, and every single silk provider is having to restructure to deal with this. All of this was outlined a year and a half ago in the Ordinary Life at Home consultation paper. It did not just happen today. It is going to be reinforced formally, operationally within the NDIA in the new home and living policy, and we've already seen draft versions of that very much support this is what's coming. I doubt the review by Bruce Bonahady is going to change it, because it's his vision from the beginning. So if we're waiting for the review to change this, it's not going to happen.
Where does the whole bit that's about the decision that I, as an individual, funded as a 1 to 3? You know, like it feels to me like I never got a choice to say I want to be on my own, I want to be only with one other person. Someone's deciding that my right support is with 2 other people or 3 other people or 4 other people. And that's blocking us, because even our ability to say, well, let's restructure and change this. There seems to be this other rule that's already been decided that I should be in one of X number.
Only if the SIL provider takes those ratios as gospel.
But we don't have to.
No.
We are.
So, I know.
Yeah. Well, it's limiting us.
So,
yeah. And it's a big limitation.
This is what it looks like now, yeah?
Yeah, that's right.
I'm psychic. Reality is, you can take any of those ratios and move them to another part of the day. We think, because of our old school mentality, that the government's seen this, and if they come in and audit and it doesn't match this, I'm going to get in big trouble. Not the case. Now, if you move a 1 to 2, and I'm not going to do the math on the spot because, but if you move a couple of ratios to make your whole numbers down the bottom, you're going to end up with some zeros that shouldn't be there. And then you're going to say to the family, all right, so to get the supports you want, in the location you want, in the house you want, this is what you can afford. And here's what's left. What are we going to do to fill that gap? Maybe we can use some proactive positive capacity building funding to plug the gap. Maybe, because you're here every Sunday anyway, you could do the support.
Yeah.
Maybe we could get a housemate rather than a sleepover, and then take all that nighttime support and put it during the day.
Yeah.
So the agency will give you recommended models, a maximum funding.
Yeah.
And when we have that full flexibility under the new policy, we will then take that and go, actually, you've got this option, this option, this option, which one do you want?
So we're not as locked in as it looks like.
Currently at the moment, you are, because the planners haven't been trained enough to understand the flexibility. So you still get this planner going, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And the families, yeah.
Well, they're a different
Because they're being explained by the planners.
And the support coordinators who
Yeah.
do not understand this, do not understand flexibility. So today's tip, which you can implement today, if you start to vary this already, which you can within the funding amount you've been given, create a new roster of care for the individual that represents the change and go, this is what it looks like, and keep your paper trail of the changes you make and say, this is what we've agreed to.
Good, that's okay, because this has been limiting us.
Yes.
Because we want to think in the way you've just said, and then you keep coming back to this rule someone made somewhere about ratios. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was because we worked in a space to make whole numbers.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But it sounds like you need to get 5 people to agree if there's 5 people in the house.
No.
Because
You need to
each
get
individual-
the location viable for you, and I know I've just said you don't do that anymore. You do, the agency doesn't. You need to care about viability, they don't.
No,
So
but
if we bring in technology, equipment, informal supports, can that work cohesively for these 3 people living together?
Yeah.
But you
Yes or no?
need the nominees, the families, to all agree to the setup.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, not
their
together.
individuals.
No, individually.
Not individually, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But we also need to go back and start changing their perception of welfare based, it's your job to fill the gaps.
Yes.
And we need to go back to, no, we can give you options and you need to pick one.
Okay, that's freer than me. That's good.
Yeah. You may still come across resistance as we're transitioning to the policy because they're implementing the policy without the guidelines. So some regions will have planners that get it, some won't, and some have been in group homes before and they know how this works.
Yeah.
So currently we're operating under the previous NDIS space where you can submit the roster of care and that will determine the funding. You may also have some people coming in with this random bucket of money. You'll be in both of those spaces. You'll be in both of those spaces until the policy is finalised. What will happen in the future, you will have this. And they've taken what is not called an independent assessment and they've applied it anyway. They've just called it something else. And I'll talk through that process in a minute. But these are the two ways you can have it. So you may, and even if you submit the roster of care, a lot of the time it will come back with that random bucket of money anyway. So you will need to be able to get to the space where you can reverse engineer to work the funding, and that's why we need to leave the emotional attachment to the roster of care as being the Bible. Because when we submit the roster of care, we think we have to follow it. The money comes in $100,000 less, and we think we're going to get in trouble for not following the roster of care, but they never agreed to the roster of care. They agreed to less than the roster of care. So of course we have to change it. And nobody's going to come in and look at that unless your service agreement has the original roster of care and you agree to that with the family and you agree to run at a loss, which why would you? Then some people you will, and you should, because you're not for profit, and if we get you financially viable enough, you'll be able to have like a slush fund where you can choose to do that for a while. Short-term, targeted, visible. But if you then go back and say, here's what the money you got is and here's what we can do for it and here's our options for filling the gap, attach that to your service agreement, you'll be perfectly fine. You just need to negotiate. So you can move away from it. Just wanted to traumatise everyone.
So Rebecca, there are instances at the moment where the NDIA will call up, ask you want a plan review to the nominee or support coordinator. They'll say yes. Then they roll it over anyway and use an assessment from a year ago. So there's no discussion with anyone. We're seeing instances of that happening at the moment. Okay, so that's common.
I'll get to that. So this is why we're seeing the changes, because they operationalised what's coming in the policy. The Silver Roster of Care tool will not determine the type of support participant will get in their plan, in black and white. Has no bearing on it. We'll have a look at it. Don't really care. You're lucky if you've got something on file from a year ago. Most people are taking 6 year ago data because that's all the NDIA has on file, because we didn't need to update it because we were happy with the funding we had. So you want to make sure that whatever's in there is relevant. Just another tip I heard, if you're in a place where you're finding limits to some funding, the primary diagnosis tells the computer what is available. So sometimes swapping psychosocial disability with intellectual disability will unlock a whole heap of supports that would have been closed down because the primary diagnosis was the wrong one. I learned that from Kylie as well. Very, very cool. So check if you're trying to get things like psychology and things like that, it's not really an intellectual disability function. So swap it to psychosocial and you might then open up more avenues. The roster of care will only be used in 2 specific circumstances: as part of the supporting information for a participant's first plan, we'll get back to that, or if the participant has experienced a change in circumstances and this change in support needs can't be delivered within the participant's existing funding. So if you've got an underutilised capacity building budget that family won't let you get access to, you are not getting a change of circumstances. So be aware of that. Now there's one more. A participant SIL funding is not linked to a specific provider, existing service, or a provider determined support model. So whatever you believe is the best way of working with a person, and it may be, I'm not negating that. The agency doesn't care because the provider next door would do it differently. Their organisational structure would have less layers or more layers, their risk appetite would be different, their use of technology would be different, so that roster of care would look slightly different. So we need to challenge ourselves and go back to if we stay emotionally invested in the way we currently do things and people around us start to change, people will have options about who's the right person to provide this support, this rigid organisation, or this one who has come to me with 3 options for what I can choose. And the agency, this is why they're going to say to you, don't care about your risk, don't care about your staff, don't care about any of that. We're going to talk about what the person needs. Once the participant has an approved plan, providers then can discuss the exact supports to be delivered. So this is where it tells you can go against the roster of care. Because once we've got it, you can then do what you want, and again, we don't consider vacancy costs. So really starting to shift people away from that block-funded mentality, and this is directly from the operational guidelines and provider guidance. This one, well, if we start claiming on this ridiculous funding we've been given, then we agree to it. So we're going to take a stand and we're not going to claim.
How can it be individual funding if you don't consider vacancy costs? Because wouldn't that mean I'm now, okay, you get the funding, but I'm unable to get the support I need because of vacancies? So
because my provider's no longer viable.
Well, because
my showering needs
Yeah.
today don't change when my housemate move out. Yesterday, my provider said it was enough. Now you're telling me it's not because that guy did something. That's not reasonable. Why should I cross-subsidise what he's doing? Why should you increase my funding? So it's passing on the vacancy problem to the person. Now, we don't have endless time today, but I think it's also important to help people to understand that the things you will do when there is no vacancy might be different to the things you will do when there is a vacancy. You will be adding in benefits just from being you that will no longer be possible if that person says, I don't want to live with that housemate, I don't want to live with that housemate, actually I don't want to live with anyone else and I'm going to block that vacancy. Then they need to acknowledge that the funding they have doesn't cover all the things they want, that they're actually funded for a shared living environment, and this is what the problem is.
Yeah, the problem is usually it's the other way around. No one can come in because of the behaviours.
Correct.
As opposed to...
Yeah, and look, there's still going to be those problems where we're like, let's solve 90% and the 10% we're going to have to get together as an organisation and say, what do we do? And is that cluster living?
Yeah.
Is it that, we get 2 houses together and some of the support is done next door? And
you'll undermine the whole reason this exists for choice and control and individualised if we run that argument too strong. We have to find a different way around this, because the whole idea of the market is we have a customer, and in the same way as if I go to the shop and I say I'd like to buy that, and they say, oh yes, but you can't have that till 4 other people order the same pair of shoes. I'm going to go, what that, I'm not interested in whether 4 other people want those or not, I want them today. In many ways, it's that same thing. We have customers now who want to purchase the supports that are in their plan, and it's our problem if we can't, we shouldn't be in the market if we can't work around this. And it's separate to them that we have to figure out how we do that. Because we're a provider that's meant to be able to say, yeah, let's work with you about the money you've got and what you want. Legacy and the group home model and the way we've built them is an added difficulty for service providers like us. Yep. If I was setting up a brand new one and opening my doors tomorrow to the new customers, which lots of people are, they're our competitors, they don't have the legacy. So we're working a bit with the legacy thing as well. But we're right back at trying to understand this well enough so we can design the solution. The solution should never be about client 1 has to be impacted by the decisions of 3 other people too much.
Yeah. Correct. And I wouldn't be here today if I didn't think it was possible.
Yeah, that's right.
I honestly do. And part of that is, again, taking the stuff in seal that shouldn't be in there and getting it out. Part of it is your finance department understanding we don't want to work in accruals anymore, so we don't want to smooth things out and just make it work. We want to know what things are actually costing real time, and we want to be able to give that data to operations to say you can afford a vacancy for 3 months in this house, which is different to the house next door because of the makeup of the people, and after that it's going to become a problem for us. You don't have that data to work with today because finance, and I'm going to be psychic again, is working under a block funded mentality. They're not giving you that data. They're not able to go down to that level, and we need to get there. So this is, the whole organisation needs to shift and not just say you guys need to do it. And one of the other things I hope I get there is understanding that often we invest in a lot of these structures, but we forget the fact that on the ground, if we can't make it work, that is bad press, that is bad marketing, and it means that people are going to stop coming in our vacancies anyway. So we also need to invest in listening to operations and the problems that are arising and be able to respond to them. To do that, operations needs to go, okay, there's learning for me here too. I need to be able to shift from that model. But it doesn't mean that it's just, oh, that's their problem, which is what historically has happened everywhere. Yeah. This is the process that came out as the appendix, I told you, for the Ordinary Life at Home consultation paper. This is the one that basically says there'll be an independent assessment. So a draft plan is created, built from an understanding of your capability rather than your disability. No roster of care at that point. You already have a predetermined amount of money assigned to you based on what the computer matrix told us. Then we'll talk to you and you can convince me why that's not enough. At that point, you're still not included. So you need your families and whoever's at that meeting to have all of this stuff we talked about today in their head, ready to say why it's not going to work. Then we're going to be happy because we got it signed off and ready to go. Then you talk to the providers with my predetermined funding budget and say, what can you do for me? And I'm going to go to as many people as I need to. And because we're not linked to properties anymore, if I'm already living in an existing property and I find my provider too rigid and not willing to change and not being able to help me make my plan work, I can vote the provider out because I have tenancy rights. So it's not, this is the only way it can be done. So the home and living policy will operationalise that even more because they're looking for firmer separation, and we've definitely seen that in the draft. And I think that, again, we're in that mentality of we are the home and the supports, and we are not. With tenancy rights, we are the supports, and sometimes we are also the home, but those two things aren't linked. This is where exploration and design comes in. You may find that the person has a predetermined support budget and they go, I don't know how to make that work. So potentially they'll get that ILO funding to be able to really start to map that out, which would be really cool if everyone got that actually paid for. This, I love when the NDIA puts a tick on things, and then we got it all right and we live an awesome life and we're so happy. So this is theoretically already happening. You're already seeing this. It's, so we knew this was going to come in July 2020 and 21. I don't know. I told you before. And then we had already seen things that when we saw this flow chart, we went, that's where that's coming from. So this is not new. This is just, and if that's why you need to read these obscure documents and be able to say, okay, that's where it's happening. So yes, you do need to be able to have people in here that understand this, but the information's there for you. Yeah.
Interesting use of words, an ordinary life as opposed to an extraordinary life.
Yes, and they define that in that consultation paper. It's really worth a read, but like I said, banned book, it's really helpful. This came out, the supporting evidence form. It popped up on the website and it was just like, fill this in if you want to, it'll really help us. This form is your independent assessment. So whatever is on that will create that original support budget. So be very, very careful about what goes on this form. And it is now no longer, if you want to, it's mandatory. Every time you have a new plan with home and living supports in it, and every time you go for a plan review, this form, which is why you're going to trigger a reassessment. Irregular supports are still happening. Don't know where they'll sit in the future, but I thought I'd just put the slide in there, but we don't need to take up time with this. You already know this. If you send in a SIL submission right now, if you have the lucky opportunity to do that, you probably won't get the money you want. That's a lot of words to say that. What might happen? Your roster of care might be accepted and approved and a service booking made. Your roster of care might be accepted and approved and the money sits in the flexible core budget waiting for you to move it across. The reason that's happening is because we're also breaking down entitlement. Because a person gets approved funding in their plan does not mean they have to give that full funding to that provider. So we no longer negotiate with the agency. The person has a home and living budget that they can spend on whatever they want, even if it's bad decision making. So really important that we remember that that money will sit in the flexible core bucket. So we need the support coordinator to understand that that was for us. And we need to also make sure that our value and what we think is value for the client is what they think is value for them. And we can convince us to give the whole lot to us, because it doesn't necessarily mean that we have an entitlement to it. And we can get into indexing as well, but we don't have time today because that's the thing as well. You might have the total amount amended, reduced or increased, service booking made, no explanation, just here you go, here's your new money, and it's like, that's a lot less, what happened there? And no one will tell you why. They've said they're not going to. Sometimes you'll get emails. It is your head office email in the Quality Safeguard portal that they are sending the information to. And a lot of time that's linked to some person that left 4 years ago. So just go check that. Sometimes we're still seeing it going to random people, but in the future, the Making SIL Better campaign said that's where all communication will go to. But in most cases, the SIL provider won't get it. In the future, the information will be built into the PACE portal, which is the new NDIS portal name. So it'll be available to the support coordinator and PACE. Yeah. Which is rolling out, and the working group's already happening, and Tasmania's going to trial it. Yeah. Isn't it nice I put increased in there? We actually do see that sometimes, randomly. We'll get an extra $1,000 and it's like, wow, awesome. Sometimes you'll get the summary of ratios. Now you're more likely to see your individualised funding is X amount of hours per week and the rest is shared support. Sometimes I'll say 1 to 3 and those type of things, but a lot of the time it's just a bucket of money and you can do it. And it does say things like typical recommended.
While you're just talking about language, as you talk about before, when we put in a change of circumstance, which we put in a lot, come back recently that that's not a change of circumstance, that's actually a review or a reviewable decision. So is a review of a reviewable decision, because if you put a change of circumstances, that's not backed. Is a review or a reviewable decision reviewing the reason why that was not backed?
Yes, that's this form.
Right.
Feels so
the language has changed.
Yes. So you can't do it.
Yep.
The participant can.
Yep.
If they believe it's insufficient, they need to submit this form within 3 months of the
And
decision.
the coordinator has no responsibility in that. Because a lot now we're getting some coordinators to initiate the change of circumstance.
Oh no, they can. Yeah, they can. Because if a person says, I don't have the ability to do that for myself, that's what they're paying for under support coordination. But a provider definitely can't do it. Because you're reviewing their assessment of their individualised funding, not saying we're not viable.
Yeah.
So it's not an adjunct to a change of circumstance. It's actually a different process.
It's a different process. My plan was created and I'm unhappy with the decision that was being made.
After
So
3
that's-
months, I think, when the 3 months passed, and then you have to start the
Correct. But that person needs to be different than they were before the 3 months. And a lot of time they're not. We're actually trying to do this, not a change of circumstances, because then it's, how did they change? They didn't.
And the discussion I had with you during the break about that individual, I put in a change of circumstance and they continually got back. When it came back and I resubmitted more evidence, then they got back to me and said, well, this is not a change of circumstance, this is a review of a reviewable decision.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
then you got to go back and say, well, what decision is being reviewed?
Yes.
Is it the change of circumstance or is it the core funding?
Yes, yeah. There will be some circumstances that you will want to go to AAT, 100%, strategically. We need to really start to go, which ones are legitimately needing to go there and which ones is us not changing our mentality, and separate them, and then absolutely support the person to, if that is relevant for that, yeah. But right now we can't do that because our language is wrong, our system isn't set up for this, so we can't actually know when we're going to be successful or not. And if we go with all of them, we're going to get the reputation as being that provider that just comes in and goes with all of them. So they'll then just listen. Yeah.
So also, at the moment, we have participants on change of circumstance.
The support coordinator.
The support coordinator.
Yeah.
Well, they were told no, only 3 months before the end of the plan.
That's
there's
because
no
they're putting in a request, they're putting a change of circumstances in place of this, so they should be putting in a request for a review of a decision up to 3 months. They can, absolutely. Yeah. They may not understand the difference between those two forms. Yeah. And it's changed. We used to be able to use the change of circumstances, and now they're saying, no, we want this. And, you know, those things change overnight, and there's no rollout. I think DSC is probably one of the only organisations that's helping to navigate the changes that happens.
If that happens because we have roughly 45 to 50 people fit that criteria, just flag it with the RD because we'll talk with the support coordinator.
Okay, cool. Next step.
Change of circumstances is now called change of details or change of situation. So they're using their language to change what's happening. What situation has changed for the person? So we can no longer use it to fix our ratios, to make viability, and we need to make sure that we can really evidence that the person is different today than they were yesterday, and why their functional capacity has changed. So just make sure that we're really starting to go back to that. And some people will need a review under the new model because their legacy funding wasn't right, because the evidence we had wasn't right. So if you can now go and create a whole new package of evidence and go, we're willing to run the risk to submit this as a change of situation for this life stage, then you may find that you get actual more funding than you were before, or appropriately funded.
And that's where we sit for VDAS. The evidence we had upon transfer, because it was never required, wasn't there. So really we're saying now there's evidence that never existed showing what the functional capacity is, which is very different to what was there at transfer.
Yeah. You also want to empower the people you're working with and their families, whoever's making the decisions, to be very specific with the allied health about what they need in those reports. We used to get reports from a GP that says this person needs to be supervised because they've got diabetes, and what if they eat themselves to death? I don't know that the most cost-effective, back to reasonable and necessary approach to deal with this is having a support worker sit up all night staring at a fridge. You know, it just doesn't make sense that that's the case.
We're finding we need to facilitate care meetings with all the specialists to get them to work together and use the right language.
Yes.
But the families don't have capacity to do that, or the support coordinators in reality.
Yeah, and I think if I was Life Without Barriers family and I was aware that that wasn't part of your job and you were doing it anyway, that would be a really cool added value. You need to sell that as an added value, not an expectation of your role.
Yeah.
I don't mean like, hey, we're doing this for free. You know what I mean? Like, just really clear.
With the extra you get.
We understand that you can't do this, and we are happy as a not-for-profit to invest back into doing this with you while you learn, not for eternity, while you learn, and we build your capacity to do that. And if you can't, is there someone else that can?
And it's usually driven by crisis situations.
Yeah.
So we often are in those scenarios because things are going wrong.
Yes. I also think that your finance team should give you a discretionary bucket to be able to facilitate those, because I don't think it should be done ad hoc. I think it's really important that we say, for this family, we are investing, and we track and we limit, and we're really clear about what that looks like, because we're not in the space where we can just do it all for everyone. You want to be intentional in your decision making to do those things, because some people can fund it through their NDIS plan and they're choosing not to. They're choosing to make you do it because there's capacity building funding in their plan that's going underutilized. And potentially they could be funding you non-face-to-face support to actually do that for them.
We can't tell that either,
Why?
because we don't necessarily have a copy of the plan. In
No,
every case.
but you can say, if your plan is being underutilised, there are some options. We can do this for you under non-face-to-face support, which can be funded under core. If you don't have a plan that's able to facilitate that, we do as an organisation have some space to do that pro bono. Please let us know. To do that as pro bono, potentially they could show you a copy of their plan to be able to prove that you should invest and help them, because that's reasonable, because they're expecting you to do something for free.
Okay.
That's really interesting because we do a lot of that
Yeah.
sort of care meetings where we get all the providers, and it has a number of advantages. Once it gets all screechy and everybody together, so we're all talking about the same thing, we're all on the same page. We can use it to improve the services for the residents and explain them more. We can also use it to advocate for funding to get them to put it forward. So it's a really, it's interesting that we don't have to do it, or it's not something that we're mandated to, because it's a really beneficial process for the resident, for the individual resident, and for the individual resident's funding. I find it really, really good. And I do a number of them in my areas.
So to be able to get access to that, we want to break down, are we doing it for our viability? Are we doing it because they don't have the ability to problem solve and manage their own arrangement? If they don't have the ability to problem solve their own arrangement, that's funded under ILO. That's what an ILO provider does. So should that person, it's recognised in ILO. ILO has shifted the fact that it should be a function of support. It should be in the overhead. 10 years down the track, you won't be expected to do that. Right now, we can use non-face-to-face support to facilitate the ILO funding that we don't have access to in SIL. But you need to be really clear, we're not just passing on costs. Does this person want the change? Is it beneficial to them? Is it worth spending their money on?
And as Noelle said, it's usually driven by a crisis, something has come up, whether it's a risk to the individual, and we have to all get on the same page and have these discussions. And it's very, very effective.
Yes.
And it's very effective in, as Carol and I'm getting BSP's progressed and getting lots of things that we get stuck on progress because we have this where we all come together. They're really, really very functional.
When we go back to the definition of SIL providers put support workers in the home.
Yeah, I know.
They don't do that.
I know.
But you as a provider offer that service that can be funded through the NDIS plan. And sometimes you do it for free, and that's okay too, because that's really
So
cool.
it needs to clearly be documented within the service agreement as to whether or not for this person we're going to provide this service and whether we're charging for it or not, depending upon the reason.
I don't know that I'd back yourself into the corner that much. You don't want clauses in your service agreement that stop you from acting in ways you need to match your own viability and to make things happening. So once you say we will not, you then can't.
Oh, okay.
So the wording I generally use is, in some cases, blah, 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 we will negotiate this with you on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes we will choose to, and sometimes you will want that from us and you can absolutely buy that service. It may come as an additional cost, but we'll talk to you about it. It leaves it open, but it also says it's not just a part of the service. Your service agreements can really set the scene in this.
And when we get those people in the speeches, the physio and all together, they're actually drawing down on the individual's funding.
Correct.
So
and you're in the room for
they're
free.
getting paid for it because they're drawing it down. The hours, we don't have an hour's meeting, they're charging
Correct.
an hour for it.
Yes. There's money in capacity building and there's money in core to facilitate all of that. We need to get out of the pass on the cost.
But is that capacity building? Is having those meetings and having, we're bringing all the providers, is that capacity building or is that?
If it's non-face-to-face, no.
But if it is face-to-face.
If it's face-to-face and the person's with you and you're helping them to learn how to facilitate supported decision-making, yeah, you could do that through capacity building. If it's more a training, like I'm going because I want to hear from them, then they could fund you under training for parents and carers, which is a capacity building.
Or it's just communication, saying, look, these are the issues that we're having with this resident, and you get the full.
Yeah.
And I'll help you if they're telling you,
Sometimes.
I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. So rather than having individual meetings and discussions with each provider, you get them all at one stage.
Yeah,
And
so
it's for the benefit of the resident, quite dramatically sometimes.
do they agree?
The resident.
Yeah, because there's a difference. We believe it's beneficial,
Yeah.
our decision.
Yeah.
They believe it's beneficial, they can pay for us to be in the room. It's just that different mentality. You can't go out there and say, you're going to charge you to go to all your meetings, because they may not think that's value for money. They may not want to spend their plan that way, and they may need to go, you know what, I'll go to the meeting and I'll tell you what to do. You don't need to be there. May not be the best decision for your business, but that's the difference. Are we there because we think it's important, or we're there because we've helped them to understand why it's important and they pay to have us in the room? Yes.
Okay, so what Jeff was talking about, which we were literally wanting to do this and try to do this over 2 years ago, is that it's a multidisciplinary team approach. Now, yes, the environment, the people that we support, 99.9% of them, they don't know these meetings are taking place because we've got the support coordinator helping to organize and facilitate. It is bringing in all the allied help, the behavior support, myself, the OM, the house supervisor, and we are working, the person is at the center of what we're actually doing, but it's trying to get that collaboration with all of those key stakeholders so that we are actually working together collaboratively. That is our values. That is,
Yes.
that's always been, for the 35 years that I've been in this world,
Yes.
we've always wanted to do and do well.
Yes.
So getting the person or the family, sometimes there's families there.
Yep.
I know there's a couple that, we've got families there. But I do have, behavior support practitioner agencies that say LWB is the only ones that's doing this. The other agencies, other organizations are not doing that. Is that because we're still using some of our block funded,
No.
mentality
that's
or
progressive.
whatever? Or are we actually paving a way here to try to actually still try to do best practice?
I mean, that's recognised in microboards and things like that as
Yeah.
well. It's absolutely there. I do want to say, when we're thinking about whether that could be funded, under the Quality Safeguard Practice Standards, anything that is talking about your funding, those type of things, is an overhead. So if you're in that room to figure out how to get good outcomes for the person and to work together on that, not to determine what funding goes to which person, because those meetings, who gets what funding, are an overhead. Ongoing meetings to talk about risks and planning and those type of things, that's legitimately for the person. So
And that's the meetings we're talking about here.
yes,
So
Yeah.
yes.
It's around
So,
change
but
programs.
some people go, well, I've got to do my supervision and I've got to figure out how to do the roster of care and I've got to put together all the evidence. No, that's just you putting together a quote, and that should be costed into your overheads. Going in and working out strategies and those type of things, that's participant support, and if it's done in a group, even better. Yeah. When you submit the whatever it's called now, you also need to do this form, which is why I said you're going to trigger it. Just a couple of reminders, and I know we're getting towards the end. All right, then I want to skip through some of this and you can read it, and if we have follow-up questions, we'll do that, because I do want to get to the things that will help you to... Is it okay if we skip programs of support?
I don't know.
And we'll do that in... We'll
I think
skip
so
forward
for
and we'll
this
come
one.
back if we
Yes.
have time,
Yeah.
if that's all right, because it's not as relevant. So this is one of I'm doing a lot of work in reworking service agreements, and this is the stuff you don't see. You see Clause A, Section 2, we will sue you if you don't give us $200 if you pass go. This is the stuff that's relevant because it's what your families want to know. What are you doing during the night, and how will that benefit me, and how do I know my person's safe? The overnight supports in this home are provided as inactive support or sleepover. Active supports are charged on an hourly basis at the appropriate ratio for the participant. In an active support model, there are provisions to allow for support to occur if required on an ad hoc basis. If overnight support is required in an inactive support model that exceeds what's reasonable, and that is actually defined in the operational guideline, so you don't need to define it yourself, additional funding may be required to facilitate that support, and we'll talk to you about it. It takes something that was vague, and I kind of know you're there all night, right? But I don't know what you do. I don't know how often you get up and how often is reasonable. So it helps, and this type of service agreement will start to build relationships and conversations about boundaries of support. We're telling them what it is, what it isn't, and we're not backing ourselves into a corner. So this is what I said before about, you don't want to say we don't do that, because sometimes you'll want to do it and sometimes they'll want you to do it. If you want to do it, don't ask them for money. If they want to do it, absolutely, you can talk to them about funding that through the plan. This type of information is what they need, but it's not out there, and we're not necessarily writing anything to that. So when you come back to say who's going to pay for this training, your service agreement can train them every single year. And this is a conversation where each one of these headings is like, look, in overnight support, it's going really well right now. We don't actually have a lot. We've had 3 times where we've triggered an active night. Nothing for you to worry about there. Actually, in the last month, it's gotten pretty high. We're using your irregular support budget, but that's actually lowering quite quickly. Next time you talk to the agency, can you let them know that this is a problem?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, they've got the language they need because they've got the headings. And when the agency calls, says, do you want to roll it over? Actually, I want to talk about overnight support and I want to talk about supports in the community. And we've empowered them. They don't know all the language, they don't know any of that, but they know that last time they spoke to you, this is the problem area, and they want to explore what that looks like. And if you back that up with three options for them to fund, they'll even go in there empowered to talk about them. We could get this equipment, but in the meantime, we want to have this particular thing happen. So it's about using the functions we already have to use for safeguarding and building this type of stuff into it so that it really helps them to understand. I'm gonna skip that because I think we've covered it. These are the type of things that aren't in SIL. Love the second last one. Items covered in other sections of the NDIS price guide. How vague. It's great. But it is transport, it is assistive technology, it is personal care, well, in the workplace, all of those type of things. So also, you know, personal care while participant is hospitalised, there are some appropriate times where you can work in the hospital and that can be funded. But it also helps the person to understand that when their loved one's in the hospital and they're saying don't claim because they're not with you, you've got no right, theoretically they're saying don't manage the arrangement either. I'm pretty sure they don't want that to happen. They want you to attend the meetings, they want you to figure out discharge, they want you to potentially even visit. So it might make sense that although their roster of care will look different, you're converting that to support in the hospital, so you still have a right to claim. You stop or you keep going, the funding might look different. Under a program of support model, you wouldn't need to stop claiming at all because they could agree to that happening. There are 2 cases where support in the hospital is relevant, and we can talk about what they are if we get to it at the end.
This part's interesting because, for example, SDA related costs, maintenance, repairs, so it doesn't sit under SIL, but we're still accountable for it occurring with the community visitors at the moment.
Yes, because from what I understand, and I did move out of Victoria, the Victorian government or the people owning the homes have been very cheeky and has still expected you to do a lot of their functions. The negotiation back needs to go, okay, well there's a very clear separation here and we need to have that separation as part of our quality safeguard framework so we can do this for you. What does that arrangement look like?
Okay.
Yeah. I think the best way to talk about this one is just get comfortable talking about funding, and that's the conversations we're having today. You can really start to unlock stuff when we lose that it's dirty to talk about money. We've all come from the sector a really long time, and talking about funding feels awkward. Talking about funding with families feel awkward. Right now, quality support for people includes being able to empower them to talk about their funding. It's not a separate part of it anymore. It's not finance's job. As direct support workers, we need to help them to be able to get the best out of that, and we need to remove that welfare-based stigma around talking about money. But you can see today I was incredibly participant-focused. No, you can't pass on that cost, but absolutely they can buy it from you. It's really empowering language and saying, no, that's yours, yes, that's theirs, and really starting to understand the difference will keep the power in the person's hands because we're not working to just, like I said, do a money grab. So we need to get to a space where, and if it feels uncomfortable, I think that's worth a meeting in itself. and starting to shift our culture around why are we feeling uncomfortable around this and what do we need to do as people to unlock that and honour the place we've come from, because it's a massive cultural change.
So we'll need to think about this with all our supervisors, hence the December forum, so that it just gives some thought around the best way to do that, how we ease them into it, because it's quite different to what people are used to.
I had a scenario in here for you. We've already talked about that. I won't go through it. These are some of your options. If Ali's funding got changed, and we won't do the scenario, you can encourage them to challenge the decision, which it sounds like has been an automatic response. You can continue to do whatever it used you before and absorb the loss. Again, that's something that feels like what most providers are doing. You can remove the supports just in a very rigid way, say, sorry, you're not funding that off anymore. I wouldn't recommend that. I think there's transitional approaches, but reality is you can't charge for it. So at some point, if you've got a family saying you can't have access to the rest of my plan, that response will be appropriate in some cases, and you need to get ready for that, because they've got a bucket of money and they're saying you're not having it all, but they're also expecting you to do more with less. So that also needs to be onus on them as well. You can complete an internal risk assessment and go, all right, well, the money's not there anymore. What do we need to do as a provider to get to a place where it is okay? And that might mean changing our policies. It might mean changing a whole heap of things. Again, that's strategic at much higher levels than operationally. So if we're trying to make this on the ground at team leader level, we're going to come into a lot of problems because it needs the support of people above. You can request a review for specialist suggestions and technology and equipment, all of those type of things. You can also do an assistive technology assessment, and they can be funded through plans. They're really cool. And Brent, who I've spoken about, he does that in his, and they're getting $50,000 to $100,000 a year reduction in direct support costs from off-the-shelf technology. It is incredibly cool. And again, not miracles, not people living on their own unsafely and just looking at a screen, like really cool outcomes. We'll skip that. These are the line items in the capacity building price guide. I have no doubt that you are registered for development of daily living and life skills, because it looked like SIL and we all ticked the things that looked like it is what we do when we registered. So I'm pretty sure, but double check. SIL is 0115 and this is 0117. So if you go in the support catalogue, thank you, and you filter based on 0117, all of these will pop up for you. And I'm sure there'll be more when the new support categories come out. So skill development and training, I don't have my original slide that some of these relate to improve relationships, some of them relate to those other categories, and I would have been helpful to have them on here. But the hierarchy for supports, if we use allied health as a really good one, and we use physio. So a physiotherapist can be funded at a rather large rate to come in and work with a person to understand their situation and to design a program for them. An allied health assistant gets paid less and they come in and they implement that. An allied health assistant can then train a support worker at whichever one of this, I think it's individual skill development and training, to implement the strategies designed from the physio, trained by the allied health assistant, and for a much cheaper rate to be carried out proactively by a support worker with no additional training. But if you need additional training for that piece of equipment, you can fund it under training for carers and parents. So really important that we know that if a person gets a new piece of equipment, we can do that reactively within our 1 to 3 on shift, trying to figure out how to help them learn to use it, or we can fill in a gap with 3 hours a week worth of capacity building support to learn how to use the equipment. Can be your support workers that are already working the home for consistency. It'd be under a separate service agreement where they say, I'm going to give you $5,000 to spend over the next 3 months to really invest in this piece of equipment, and then we'll revert back to the ordinary SIL under your 1-to-3 ratios. These are the ways where we start to use capacity building.
So just on that, because we quite often do that now. We have people come, physios come in, and then they'll come back to a team meeting. It's not SIL, but they claim it. They will provide training and so forth. So are you saying now that should be a different?
You know me well enough to know there is no should.
But what they're doing is they're usually claiming that out of it. They get X
And we're not professional enough
Yeah,
to
the
get
residents
paid.
get X amount of funding for physio or speech therapists. Then the speech therapist will come in and train the staff on how to use those augmented devices. But that comes out of the residents' funding.
Yes.
And so what's
So, I think it's really important that we professionalise and we say, when you get that new piece of equipment, please don't forget to figure out how you're going to learn to use it. We can offer that service. And if we're offering that service, can you train us how to use it? But as an aside, support workers potentially should be trained to use it. You'll get resistance from planners because they still have the mentality of block funding that says it's in your overheads. It's not. This is not part of your training. Manual handling training is in your requirements of under the practice standards. Support on particular disabilities, that's just what you need to do because you're a disability support provider. Support on that particular piece of equipment should be funded with the equipment.
or that speech, augmented speech?
So the other really good one is, I think it's individual social skills development. Your old social stories, if you use them in the moment, they're not really going to do much. You need to have practiced them beforehand, but how do we have time to practice all of that stuff? All the, what do you do when you're getting upset? Let's role play that. That, individual social skills development. Reactive is supported independent living. We're going to help you to remember how to do it as part of your daily activities. Learning it in the first place is capacity building. And that's why I said I'm not talking miracles. We're not talking Ben's going to get out of his wheelchair and walk and Sarah's going to live on her own. We're talking about if we invest in capacity building around this thing, that equipment will mean our reactive staffing for falls reduces. Our ratios go from 1 to 1 to 1 to 3. Because a lot of our ratios are around reactive just in case there's a problem. This type of stuff can build capacity and reduce ratios in a shared and support environment.
So this is what's really important when we've got people that are on lots of restricted practices. We've got beautiful BSPs that have a massive amount of recommendations and strategies in them. And we need all of this so that we can actually implement
Correct.
that.
But we don't ask for
I
this.
think we still have a broken cycle here though, because we're not getting that yet.
Because we ask for more SIL funding. Because we're reactive. And we're saying it's a risk. But instead, and hopefully in the future, they've said, we're not going to review SIL funding, that'll stay static. We will do reviews for capacity building funding. So we need to empower people to ask for this. We also need to remove the stigma because we're no longer asking for SIL funding. We're asking for capacity building funding that could be done in conjunction with SIL and through this.
So in Karen's example there, who should be asking for this funding?
That's my next question.
Should Karen's behaviour practitioner write that in their recommendations
Yes.
around what funding is built
Yes,
into the plan?
we need to
and
build
actually
this.
support
We need to
coordinator
also
as
have
well.
money for the direct support staff to be trained, and we want to do some proactive over the next 3 months to be able to do that. If we were to do this, we anticipate that the ratios of support will be reduced longer term. Investment.
Absolutely. We're talking, this is big, this is bigger than Ben-Hur, that we're actually, because we're only 18 months into this new world in this space.
Yeah.
And so we actually don't have any of this really happening yet.
No one
We're
does.
still getting behavioral support practitioners for recommendations in for an OT.
Yeah.
And for a speech.
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
to actually
Correct.
develop, or do
Yeah.
assessments and communication.
And 6 months ago, you didn't need to know this. You needed to know how to put in a change in circumstances to get your SIL funding increased.
Yeah.
So this is not you learning it. This is everyone learning it and saying those preconceived notions around what capacity building and SIL is need to change, because in your mind, you can't do that and SIL, it's double dipping.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's not. If we have that 3-hour gap in a roster of care because we've moved those ratios to do other things, then we can bring in 3 hours of proactive support capacity building. Don't get attached to it. Capacity building is time limited. But imagine if we got to use that equipment, reduced it down, and then we went back for another piece of equipment or technology. Imagine the possibilities moving forward. We're trying to achieve miracles in a 1-to-3 ratio reactive support, and it's just not possible. These are the things that we really
So
need
at
to
the
focus
moment,
on.
we've gone back and asked NDIA to give us, for the next 3 months, 1-to-1 funding, 4 hours a day for a person to put the speech and OT things in place in the hope to reduce the behaviours. So what you're saying is, instead of doing it like that, we would go through these items. And
I think there's two things. One is you will always have to be reactive for some people. So I would absolutely have your typical week SIL, and you can do this in the roster of care. Typical week SIL, discretionary SIL for reactive behaviour support in conjunction with capacity building around trying to find the root cause of the behaviour, build the skills to then reduce that so you could reduce the discretionary funds and then hopefully one day, but probably not, the ratios.
And I would say wherever you're having reactionary stuff, you should have this.
Yes.
So if you're telling me you need to react to a situation that's likely to happen more than once, it shouldn't be just the reactionary piece.
Also, you need to value the work you do. So we don't write down all the stuff that is proactive positive supports because they're working. We only record incident reports. We only record the problems. So you know that if a support worker goes in and spends half an hour with Ben when he gets in off the bus and we help him transition in and talk about his day and pack his bag, he won't hit Margaret at dinner. We don't record that as proactive positive support. It's word of mouth. And you know how you know that you have to do it? Because the one day the support worker doesn't, Margaret gets hit and then there's an incident report. And we go, we told you in induction. Come on now. We told you this. We don't talk about that. We don't list that as proactive positive supports. We go, tick, solve the problem, move on, because we're in a block funded mentality. We need to value the work we do every day and document that. There is an example, a really good one. We know that we need 2-to-1 transfers because this person's likely to kick out at a person while they're in their sling. Because when they lived at home with mum, they got dropped and now there's a problem. And we know that when we've got a turnover of staff, it gets worse because there's inconsistency, and let's face it, that's what we're in right now. In that particular case, why is there a problem? Because that person is worried about falling. So we don't want to make them independent in transferring because we know that's not possible. We can rule that out. However, is there a way that they can learn proactively under this to raise and lower the sling themselves? So if the control's in their hand, that support worker who doesn't listen and is too worried about the next thing they've got to do can't rush through it and not listen to the person going, hang on a minute, slow down, because it's in their control. And if we proactively use time to train that, we've built capacity. Yeah. The actual situation hasn't changed, but we've gone from 2-to-1 to 1-to-1 because it's less likely, unless the support worker tries to override that person's right to do that themselves and tries to rush them, in which case it's a training problem, because the risk has been reduced. A lot of our high ratios are just in case a problem occurs, and training. If we think support workers need additional training in that, sometimes it's our problem around rights, responsibilities, respect, and sometimes it's, I know how to use that equipment, you never told me, in which case there's training for carers and parents.
And what Karen was saying before about BSPs, we get very complex BSPs with 10, 20 pages. Now we can't expect direct care staff to, the resident has behaviour, so I'll go review this document, spend the next 2 hours going through the document. So we have to, we try to get cheat sheets and quick responses, but we also have to get training involved. So we have to have that practitioner come in and say, look, this is what I'm actually saying. I've done this big thing because I need to do it, but to actually practically implement it, I need to train these staff. So does that come out of capacity building?
09 is behaviour support.
So if we have to pay
or 11? Oh no,
if we
don't
have to
test
pay
me.
for staff to come in to be trained,
Before you get too excited, the person and their family need to see the value
Yeah.
in your staff being trained.
That given, is that a skill? Is that a skill function, or is that a capacity building function? Or?
It depends what the person wants to pay for.
Okay.
Yeah, so really important that we're helping them to understand, and hopefully I can do a little bit of that this afternoon with some of them, helping them to understand this will see their people not disadvantaged under the NDIS. Sticking in block funded mentality and resisting the change, they're choosing to be in that space. And yes, we're tired and we don't want to go there, and you promised me this wouldn't happen. Pretty sure you guys didn't choose to implement in this way, but we all want the outcomes that could come at the end of this. This type of thing will mean that they will be better off long term because their support needs aren't going to exceed what is reasonable under the NDIS and continue to be reduced even when their family's been passed away. And if they're worried, set up a microboard.
I just wanted to lay on top of that is this is person-centered active support.
Correct.
Bottom line, it's person-centered active support.